What's up guys, ATCZ here, welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck of the Day. Today we're doing the final deck that got the boost from the Banlist. We did ABCs, that now we're doing Paleo, because ABC Dragon Buster and Totally Awesome are finally back at 3. Both of those decks that did not deserve to get hit when the beginning of MR5 are now back at full power, and I know that a lot of people like to use Paleo as a kind of anti-meta strategy. The deck is very fun when you try to actually do the strategy of the deck like how it's supposed to be done. I know it can struggle a little bit, especially now, because with decks like Eldritch it just is a bit underpowered compared to other control decks. But I know that a lot of people are having fun playing the deck, so I'm going to give you the list I'm playing right now. And I think it's something that can actually compete with the meta, especially now that the most competitive combo decks got butchered, so you don't have to worry about anything like something like a 5-negate board. So now the most competitive meta combo deck is Virtual World, and you don't really care about calamities, so you don't really mind if you get hit by that. So it's a bit of a boost for the deck, so I'm going to show you exactly how you're supposed to play it against the meta decks. So before we begin, if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming videos, and now let's get to the deck profile. So to start off with the monsters, of course we have the frogs. We play 3 copies of Swap Frog. Of course, if you open Swap Frog, then you're pretty much good to go. It's something that you want to see in your opening hand every single time. 2 copies of Ronin. I play 2. You cannot play 1. Actually, you can play 1 if you don't play Desires, but I do play Desires in the deck, so I do like to play 2 Ronin. Also, DD Crow is a card that has been seeing some play recently, so if that's something that people start playing in pretty much anything, then you have to play 2 Ronin just to make sure that you don't lose it completely just with DD Crow. And 3 copies of Dewfrog, because if you don't open Swamp Frog, then setting a Dewfrog is a fine play because it will get you to a Swamp Frog when it's destroyed. And also if you get from the deck with your Totally, you can just protect your Totally from attacks, and if you have 2 Dewfrogs on the field, you can prevent your opponent from attacking you completely. The only spell I play in the deck is 3 copies of Desires. Extravagance, still not that good, even with 3 Totally Awesome, because the deck does have a little bit of utility with some other monsters in the extra deck. Totally is not the only monster you summon from the extra deck with this deck, so Desires is really good because you play pretty much 3 of everything. And even if you banish both Ronins at worst case scenario, you don't really need Ronin in order to be able to summon Totally, because you have all those traps that will be coming back from the grave throughout the duel, so it's basically okay even if you banish 2 copies of Ronin. You do need those 2 extra cards in pretty much any trap deck, especially a weaker trap deck, because if you want to compete with something like Eldritch, which is basically the better version of any trap deck right now, even if you're playing Subterrors, Paleo, or Altergeist, Eldritch just outclasses that. In order to be able to compete with something like that, you need to be able to get as many cards as possible. For the traps, starting with the Paleo traps, play of course 3 Dynamiscus. Dynamiscus is just an amazing card. It's by far the best Paleo trap because it banishes anything, and just banishing something like Eldritch right now is really good. And if you manage to banish both copies of Eldritch when you're playing against this deck, then you're going to win the duel no matter what, because if they're playing pure, their entire deck is shut down. They will not be able to resolve any of their trap best effects, and even if they're not playing pure, they just lose the best part of the deck, because Eldritch is something that gives them the recursive ability to be able to grind throughout the entire game. So this is why Dynamiscus is such a good card. 3 copies of Canadia. I really like Canadia, even though the card has actually seen less play ever since Links came out, but now we're not that much in a heavy Link format. We do play against lots of stuff, especially with MR5 now playing all those Synchros and Xyz, so Canadia is a really good card. And if you can make sure that your opponent doesn't use the tuners when playing against Virtual World, they will not be able to go into Xiaofeng, they will not be able to use the pop effect with a trap on Xiaofeng, and then they will not be able to use their full combo to summon 2 copies of Calamities. So Canadia, if you know the choke points of your opponent's decks, then it can be really useful. If you just throw it on pretty much anything you see, then yes, it's not going to be a good card. You just have to make sure that you hit the most crucial part of your opponent's combo to make sure that you are able to win the game just like that. 3 copies of Alanoides. This is the background removal, but if you think this card is weak, you can replace it with something like Heavy Storm Duster or a Cosmic Cyclone. The reason I still like it is because it's another Paleo trap, and even if it's not the most relevant effect, like just MSTing 1 back row, the fact that it is a Paleo trap that can come back when you use another trap card, and then you can go for Xyz plays or Link plays, I think it's worth playing, even though there are better background removal cards in the game right now. And 3 copies of Marella, because you can just send your traps to the grave. I do not play Lost Wind, which is something that's very interesting. I think Lost Wind is not a good card right now because you don't really need the effect to cut a monster's attack. You just rather get it off the field, because even if you cut something like Calamities in half, your monsters are not big enough unless you go into the extra deck to deal with it anyway. So you have to get rid of the monster, because if you are not going to the extra deck and your opponent's monster is still in the field, you're going to lose even if they don't have their effects. So this is something that usually comes combos with Marilla, which is why Marilla was really good, but I still think playing 3 copies of Marilla is insane because it just gives you free traps in the grave, and since you can get so many cards in the grave and then bring them back, going into totally without requiring to use any of your frogs is still really good. So even if you're not playing Lost Wind in the deck, I would still recommend maxing out this card just like I'm doing here. The only hand trap in the deck I'm playing is 3 copies of Imperma. You don't need really good hand traps in this particular deck to compete, because now that we don't have those heavy combo decks that bring out like 3 or 4 negates with something like a hand loop or an extra deck lock, you don't care if your opponent ends on something like Calamities, because even if they resolve its effect, unless you have a hand full of frogs, then you don't really mind, because you can just set 5 traps and pass, and Calamities didn't do anything, and you can just play with your traps during your opponent's turn. So I think trying to completely stop your opponent's plays is not a relevant strategy for this deck when the meta doesn't require you to do so. So it's much more optimal to let your opponent play and then set all of your traps, and then you can just try to break their board with your trap cards. So this is how the deck should be played. So I'm playing Impermanence because I think it's the best hand trap right now, unless your deck doesn't really care about playing stuff like Nibiru. But again, this deck kind of struggles sometimes with dealing with cards. I would rather not have to waste the Dynamiscus on the Nibiru token if the Nibiru token is too huge. And of course, Impermanence is another target for Trap Trick, so if I need a monster effect negation, I can just Trap Trick for an Impermanence. 2 copies of Ice Dragon's Prison. This card is much better this format than it was last format. Last format, it was usually something to out Dragoon because some decks kind of struggled against it, and this is one of those decks. If your opponent has Dragoon on the field, then this deck kind of struggles to deal with it, so Ice Dragon's Prison is the easy out of that. But now with stuff like Eldritch being so relevant, this card is actually really good because in some scenarios you can get rid of both Eldritches, and this is absolutely insane. If your opponent greeds with 1 Eldritch in the grave and they use another one of those traps to get another one from the deck, then you can just get them both out of the game, so you pretty much win the duel right there. And it is a really good card against other decks. Dino did not get hit, so that's another really good card when you can just banish Misk from the grave and banish another Dino from the field. So it's a really good meta call. It's a card that you can get with Trap Trick, and it's a really good card overall. 2 copies of Compulse. This was the debate between 2 copies of Lost Wind and 2 copies of Compulse, but I ultimately went with Compulse because it's a much better card dealing with boards on its own. Because Lost Wind, while yes, it prevents your opponent's monster's effect, it doesn't deal with a monster. And with a deck that you have so many weak monsters, unless you go into your extra deck, then you don't really need that. You need something that can deal with monsters ultimately whatsoever. And sometimes this deck can actually play really slow. You don't get to Totally Awesome turn 1 or turn 2 every single time. Sometimes you have to grind and you will get in Totally Awesome during the mid game, so you need to be able to deal with your opponent's monsters first so you don't get OTK'd. So this is why I think Compulsory is much better than Lost Wind, especially in a slower based format, which is now. In a full combo heavy format, yes, if you let your opponent get like 4 negates, then Compulsory is pretty much useless, but right now we're not really in that kind of a format, which is what favors this deck, so this is why Compulsory is a much better card. 3 copies of Trap Trick to get all of those normal traps, especially the Paleozoic traps. 3 copies of Gozamat, still a really good card. I'm playing this over Rivalry in any time, like pretty much for the 3 formats now, because it's a much better card, and this card is really good going second. If you combo this against something that has a lot of monsters on the field, along with something like an Impermanence, especially, or some Strike, then you can just get rid of War this way. 1 Imperial Order. The only spell in the deck is Desires, and even if you draw Desires under Imperial Order, you don't really mind, because this card against some decks is auto win, especially something as like Dino, because they'll have those fossil decks and stuff. If they cannot get to Misk and they can't get to Tyranno with double pill, then they will not be able to play. And 3 copies of Solemn Strike. I prefer Strike over Judgment in this deck because it helps you break boards going second. Post siding, I would definitely side in Judgment and side out the Strikes, especially if I'm going first, because even if you're going second, then if your opponent has stuff to destroy your entire board, like they side in Storm Dusters, you need to be able to negate these, because if you don't, you're going to lose the advantage very fast and you're going to get outgrinded, so you won't be able to play. And if you're going first, of course, Solemn Judgment is a much better card, so you don't get blown out by stuff like Lightning Storm, Harp's Feather, Dust, and unevenly matched. For the extra deck, we have 3 copies of Totally Awesome. Finally, we have Totally back at 3, and now we do not need to recycle Totally with Totally unless we are in a super grindy game, and since we don't have to do that, we can actually get back our resources by adding back 2 Frog and Swap Frog, so we can go into Totally after that, because when we had 1, and even if we had 2 Totally last format, we still needed, once we use the second Totally, to recycle 1 Totally with Totally, so we have something to play afterwards. But now we have 3. Even if you get 2 Totallys on the field, if you use both of their effects, you do not have to use their effects to recycle themselves right away. You can add back 2 Frogs, then summon a 3rd Totally, and then the 3rd Totally will be able to recycle another one once you get into the grave. So now the deck can grind content a lot better. One copy of Opabinia. Opabinia is a really good card if you want to clear some boards because you can add your Deinamiscus and activate from the hand, so that's a really good card I really enjoy. Same thing with one copy of Anomalocaris. These two rarely happen, especially Anomalocaris, but it just gives you some utility in the extra deck that you can use in some certain situations, so I really like having them just in case. One copy of Cat Shark. Cat Shark helps you get totally into 4400, which is something to be able to deal with a lot of stuff, especially Dragoon, because if you cannot get access to Ice Dragon's Prison, or if you can get it but it just gets negated by Dragoon, then the only other way to deal with it is if you have another frog, set of frogs in your hand to be able to go into 2 rank 2s, so you can get your totally awesome to 44, so you can win the game with that. And one Sky Cavalier Centauria, which is another auto Dragoon, which you can summon if you cannot get access to 2 rank 2s. It will not give you a follow-up negation like Cat Shark Totally Play would, but at least you can just get rid of Dragoon this way if you have bait its effect with something like an Ice Dragon's Prison. For the Link monsters, play 2 copies of Link Spider. This is here because of the Paleo traps. They are normal monsters once they hit the field, so if you want to go into stuff like Borrelsword or Borreload, you will not be able to unless you make them into a Link Spider first, because they are normal monsters. And also this gives you Nightmare plays in order to be able to draw cards, so if you don't want to go into Totally Awesome with your traps, then this is what you usually go for first. One copy of Mr. Boy to boost your monsters, one copy of Coral Anemone. This one brings back your Swap Frog, and then Swap Frog will dump another one, so you get another big body on the field. One copy of Phoenix, one copy of Unicorn for the Nightmares. With Link Spider, it's very easy to make these, especially Phoenix, and being able to draw a card as well. And if you discard a Paleo trap to draw another trap, and then you have another something in the grave, it's basically like a plus. One Borrelsword and one Borreload. These two are here because of certain situations. The deck can sometimes OTK if you get a lot of monsters on the field with Borrelsword, and Borreload is here because it's the most optimal out against Dragoon, because you'd rather take Dragoon rather than destroying it if you are able to do so. So yep, that's the deck, guys. The deck has become much better, so if you are a fan of this deck, give it a try. It's not as optimal as it should be as a control deck, because we do have just better control decks, but I know that a lot of people do not really want to break the budget for stuff like Dogmatica or stuff like Eldblitz, so if you're a budget player and if you're a fan of frogs, this deck is definitely one for you. You can win games very easily against certain situations, and if you get the flow of the deck, then you will see exactly how powerful and how fun it is. So yep, that's the deck, guys. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming content, and we'll see you next time.